There are so many wild stories floating around about how the Bible actually came to be the Bible that I thought it's time to actually detail just how we got from the oral stories told in the land of Canaan to that Bible that is the #1 bestseller of all time. I'm fortunate to draw upon some of the best scholars in the field to piece this story together, and doubly fortunate to draw upon Dead Sea Scroll research to help illuminate many of the details. Unfortunately, though, much of what I'll recount is wrapped up in legend and tales that do not necessarily have supportive evidence. We'll keep that in mind as we start our trek. We begin right here in the land of Canaan around 722 BCE. The northern kingdom of Israel has just fallen. 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel are taken into captivity and probably dispersed. From here on out, the story of the Bible will be written by the southern kingdom. By this point, there was most likely some form of the Torah committed to vellum scrolls, but it is impossible to say how complete the account was. Whether the book of Deuteronomy was among these scrolls is still an open question. There was also an oral Torah, passed down from priest to priest, which recounts what Moses originally heard from God. The two remaining tribes are living in the south, around Jerusalem. The prophet Micah has already predicted the fall of Jerusalem. Joel, Amos, and Hosea have made their prophecies, as has Isaiah. Around the 630s and 620s BCE, Zephaniah and Jeremiah begin their prophecies with dire warnings about the fate of the southern kingdom. Ezekiel begins his prophecy right when it is basically too late. Jerusalem falls to the Babylonians, and much of the priestly and upper crust of Judah are forcefully deported to Babylon. This, in all likelihood, is when most of the Hebrew Bible was written down in the scrolls. This is the first time the people of Israel face losing their identity. This is also when the Israelites first develop a major literacy program. It appears that many of the details of the stories found in Genesis and Exodus are committed to scrolls during the Babylonian exile, and as a response to many of the stories the Babylonians are telling about their origins. For every local tale, such as the Enuma Elish, a creation story, the Gilgamesh legends, which include flood narratives, and a Moses-like story, the Israelites counter with their own versions. When Zerubbabel and Joshua lead a small party of the exiles back to Jerusalem, they are bringing back with them a major part of the Hebrew Bible and their oral law with them. Soon, Ezra will lead another contingent from Babylon to Israel, followed shortly by Nehemiah and another contingent. Almost as significantly, a large number of the exiled remain in Babylon and continue their traditions apart from what's going on in Jerusalem. When Ezra returns, he finds a different landscape. The void created by the exile was filled by various local and not so local people moving into the area. There was a significant amount of intermarriage between the Jews that remained and other locals, to a point that when Ezra reads the Torah to the assembly, it has to be translated into Aramaic, the language which came to dominate as the spoken language of the region. Following this begins a relatively short period when the remaining texts get put to scroll and the Jewish Bible essentially is completed. These include the recordings of the Psalms, Proverbs, Job, the Song of Solomon, Esther, etc. Around 332 BCE, the Greeks replaced the Persians as the rulers of the region, and there was a brief period of prosperity in the region. The period was short, though. Alexander's death brought a series of power struggles among his successors. Around 320, the Greek ruler in Egypt, Ptolemy I, captures Jerusalem, and a large number of Jews are exiled to Egypt, where they join an already thriving Jewish community centered around the city of Alexandria. By many accounts, Alexandria was the best place for a Jew to live at the time, including Eretz Israel. Legend has it that Ptolemy Philadelphus sent to the high priest in Jerusalem asking for 6 Hebrew scholars from each of the 12 tribes of Israel to be sent to Egypt to translate the scripture. When the scholars arrived in Egypt, they were isolated and required to produce a copy of the Torah in Greek. What emerged was 70 identical versions that, when combined, are known today as the Septuagint. While this makes for a wonderful story, it is almost surely fiction. First, 10 of the 12 tribes were no longer living in Israel. Had there been 6 scholars from each tribe, there probably wouldn't be any lost tribes at all. Second, the Jewish community in Alexandria was thriving and rivaled Jerusalem in size and scope. These Jews had an active religious community, including temples and priests. They knew the Greek language better than those living in Jerusalem. It is hard to imagine the Alexandrian Jews admitting they did not know their own Torah and needed to bring in outsiders to translate it. Third, there was a great reluctance of Jews living in Israel to concede that their Hebrew was disappearing. Translations into Aramaic were always considered of a lower status than the original Hebrew. Greek was a much larger threat among the conservative Jewish scholars. Greek culture taught that humans had the capability of understanding the world and achieving happiness without the need of God's revelation. Greek culture embraced nudity and exercise and cosmopolitanism that was in direct conflict with Judaism. That the Jewish conservative priests and scholars would actually facilitate the Hellenization of their own scriptures is doubtful. Finally, the simple fact that the Greek texts differ from the Hebrew in thousands, if not tens of thousands of places, demonstrates the story to be a little less than what the propaganda indicates. In all likelihood, the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek was performed in Alexandria by Alexandrian Jews. It was probably completed in steps, over time, with the Torah being first, followed by the other scrolls of the Tanakh. The letter from Aristeas, detailing the origin of the Septuagint, is almost surely a work of fiction. Regardless of this, the Greek translations gained a great deal of favor throughout the Greek-speaking empire, anywhere Jews happened to call home. That it ever achieved a high status among Jews living in Palestine is opposed by every piece of evidence from the time. There were approximately 220 biblical scrolls squirreled away by the sect living in Qumran near the Dead Sea. Of these, only 10 were written in Greek. 3 were Aramaic Targums, 15 were Paleo-Hebrew, everything else were the Hebrew scrolls. It is at this time that the Hebrew Bible reaches a crisis stage. The Library of the Dead Sea Scrolls is actually a snapshot in time of the Bible during this crisis. While the vast majority of the Dead Sea biblical scrolls are in Hebrew, they are not all of the same textual family. When the Jews under the rule of the Maccabees regained control over Israel, there was a flood of Jews who returned from Babylon, Syria, and Egypt, bringing back their versions of the Bible. All of these various families of texts can be found at Qumran, along with the Samaritan texts and the Aramaic Targums. Under the leadership of an extremely influential religious leader named Hillel, or Hillel of Babylon, one group of texts would be selected as the preferred text. Not surprisingly, Hillel chose the Babylonian version. The texts that were hidden at Masada around the year 73, the texts the Pharisees would preserve after the second failed revolt in the year 136, the texts that the rabbis would take with them as they spread out around the Mediterranean and into Europe, Asia, North Africa, and Persia, all stem from the scrolls selected by Hillel. When a group of Jewish Karaite scholars would establish a copying process known as Masorite, it was the Hillel scrolls they were using. The famous Leningrad Codex of the year 1008, from which most modern translations of the Bible stem, goes back to this very same set of scrolls.